Hey everybody, I'm Sasha White,
And I'm M.K. Fain.
and this is Identity Crisis. So today we are going to be reacting to woke Instagram, and we have a particular account that we're going to be looking at. I don't know if you guys use Instagram or just Twitter or just YouTube, but I occasionally look at Instagram particularly to see sort of what are the trends, what are people looking at, and what are the acceptable lines of talking points in policy. So that's what this account is geared towards. It is called So You Want to Talk About. And it has 2.3 million followers. It's followed by multiple celebrities like AOC and others. And what I've noticed is that it's sort of used by these celebrities and other people with a sort of shallow interest in politics to get their talking points and sort of figure out what they're supposed to be thinking and saying. So this account says dissecting progressive politics and social issues in graphic slideshow form. My translation of that would be repackaging liberal politics in easy to digest and regurgitate talking points form. So, MK, what was your first reaction when you looked at this account before we dive into some of these fun posts?
Yeah, so my first reaction when I just opened the account is honestly just how nice and organized it all looked and how easy it seemed to get information quickly. Instagram has this grid, and each square on the grid has its own pastel color. It's very welcoming and inviting, and they have easy to read, very clear text that is super clear and to the point. And so my very first thought before actually reading any of the content was, wow, this looks really professional. And I was really struck by how easy it was for me to start looking through this, start feeling like I was maybe even actually like learning some stuff on some topics. And the presentation of it really does seem targeted towards helping people get these essentially, soundbite understandings of particular political issues, which I don't think there's something inherently wrong about. We do this on our issues that we care about all the time to provide people easy to use language and help them understand in clear and concise points. But when you actually start to dig into some of the content that they're actually promoting in this format, it actually becomes quite insidious because you start to realize that they are managing to lose, I think, all of the important context that makes these issues really complex human rights issues that we're facing today. And it's really disturbing to think that this is where so many young people, especially young women who are the primary target demographic of Instagram, are getting a lot of their what are called politics these days. They're not reading books, they're reading a thread on Instagram.
Yes, exactly. And I agree. There's nothing necessarily or inherently wrong with getting information in different kinds of ways and in easy to digest ways, little sound bites sometimes. But this is not just information that's being presented, it is propaganda. And like you said, I mean, that, propaganda is something that a lot of people use. It just means one sided information. It's not always evil. I'm not saying this account is some horrible thing. I actually agree with a lot of what they say. But yes, the problem lies in that they are repackaging everything in a way to show you what you're supposed to think and to give you the talking points that you can use to argue these things. But if you only read this account, you might have those talking points, but you won't really have a deeper understanding of why you even might believe these things.
Right. And another thing that was not surprising, but really stood out to me is the comments on these, which are absolutely fawning, just tripping over themselves to thank you so much for this information. This is so helpful. Thank you for the work that you're doing. And any amount of dissent that I saw in the comments disagreeing with some of these posts was just instantly piled on. And I, just on a quick look, I didn't spend too long looking at this stuff, but it didn't seem like there was any actual deep dive happening. It seems like anything that was meant to take the conversation deeper was stopped pretty quickly if it wasn't just a kind of 100% fawning support of what was said.
Yeah, I noticed that as well. I also noticed a real gratefulness that people had, like, oh, thank you for explaining this to me. Now I know what I'm supposed to think. And when I first saw this account, the story that was currently up, which is sort of like a temporary post, was talking about who purportedly runs this account. And the person said, I'm a 27-year-old girl and I just run this account on my own. I'm staying anonymous for as long as I can, but my name is that I don't remember. She gave her first name and her age and her location, which I thought was a little strange. I mean, I encounter a lot of people who are actually very concerned about their anonymity, and they are a lot more careful than that. So we really have no idea who makes this. For all we know, it could be a corporate PR campaign, right? Like, we have no idea.
Yeah.
Just, I'm some girl.
Very true. And we've seen that they partnered with, we'll probably get into this, but they partnered with some pretty large organizations in order to create some of this content, which that's not to say that a young woman couldn't do this on her own. I don't necessarily doubt that, but this is framed as very grassroots when we can see that there's actually a lot, if not money going to this account, going to the organizations that they're partnering with and having those connections to those large organizations, I think says something about where this is really coming from, these ideas.
Yes. And just to remind people, 2.3 million followers. So this is not some little account that we are picking on. Okay, so now to get into some of these posts and sort of deconstruct them and break them down with, for ourselves in really the way that I think if people are reading this stuff, they should go through them this way. They should think for themselves as they're reading. So the first one that we want to start with is this post called The Paradox of Tolerance. I knew right away that I was going to have to look at this one because the paradox of tolerance, I heard about this a couple of years ago for the first time from people on Twitter. And it's this idea that you have to be intolerant in order to have a tolerant society, that you have to, well, I'll let them explain it, but it's something that's been really misused. And people have probably seen this cartoon floating around Twitter. I'll pop it up on the screen right now. And it's sort of like a quick and easy way to understand Karl Popper. He's a theorist that they're taking this from. And it is used by the wokedivists on the internet as sort of what they think is a perfect rebuttal to people like TERFs, who they call TERFs. Okay, so now to get into this, the paradox of tolerance. Slide 1, I really have no qualms with. They're just defining tolerance and intolerance. For tolerance, it says involves respect for the simple idea that people's ideas and lives can be different from our own. We can disagree with what they believe, but we tolerate them just as we would want them to tolerate us. Great, like if only we could just stop there and be in full agreement with them. And then intolerance involves not being able to or willing to accept that someone's ideas or lives are different from our own. Social intolerance is not new, but has become much louder, especially since 2016. They like to blame everything on Trump.
I find really interesting about this first slide is that I don't entirely disagree with anything here. I think those are, maybe not the dictionary definitions of tolerance or intolerance, but I agree that social intolerance has become louder in the past few years. And that includes, I think, some of what we actually see on this account, which is an intolerance for someone's ideas or lives being different from your own. And, we'll get more into this in the paradox, but I also find the image here a little bit interesting to describe it. It's two circles that describe tolerance and intolerance, but they overlap slightly in the center, almost like a Venn diagram. And it's hard to tell how much of this is just interesting graphic design or whether that's an intentional message. But the idea seems to be that there's this overlap between tolerance and intolerance, where in order to have tolerance, you have to have a little bit of intolerance. And again, I can't tell if they're intentionally planned that in the design of this graphic, but it does stand out at me as it looks like a Venn diagram.
What an
as if
excellent
these things aren't
observation.
actual dictionary opposites of each other that aren't inclusive of each other.
I think that is an excellent observation. I'm sort of floored. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I don't think it's unintentional. I think it is intentional. So we're going to see why as we read through this. So the next slide says, the paradox of tolerance states, If a society is tolerant without limit, its ability to be tolerant is in time seized or destroyed by the intolerant. Austrian philosopher Karl Popper described this as the idea that in order to maintain a tolerant society, the society must be intolerant of intolerance. So, first of all, most of these people who use Popper for this to perpetuate their idea that, as you very rightly pointed out, there should just be a little bit of intolerance in a tolerant society. And what they really mean is a lot of intolerance. They've never read Popper. That's pretty clear. And if you want to read an article by someone who actually has read Popper, you can find an article on plebity.org by Plebity's Mark White, which takes down this whole idea of how people are using this and why they're misusing it and what Popper really meant. So if you're curious, you can check that out. What I will say is that Karl Popper was writing in the context of right at the end of World War II. So when he was talking about intolerance, he was thinking of literal Nazis. And the way that Nazi comparisons are thrown around today, it really shouldn't happen for most things, for most comparisons. These shouldn't be made. They're not applicable. And it's certainly not applicable to say that because Karl Popper said that we need to be intolerant of intolerance, that we should be intolerant of the free speech of people we don't agree with.
And I think that it's worth wondering here, what is the actual amount of tolerance or intolerance that they're talking about? So for example, they mentioned that social intolerance has been growing, and we can tell from some stuff that they say later on that what they're talking about is essentially conservatism. But what they seem to be getting at, although they don't say this outright, so I can't say for sure, is that we should not have freedom of speech to say something that they would consider intolerant. Mm-hmm. And if we're talking about in our day-to-day lives, what should we tolerate as a person? Should I tolerate a friend saying something racist? Now, what would that actually look like? Because I don't have any real power in this situation. I'm, just someone's friend. So me not tolerating it could be something as simple as saying, actually, I think what you just said is pretty racist and harmful. And here's why I disagree with what you said, and maybe a new framing that we can consider. So that would be me being intolerant of this racism thing that just happened around me. But when we start to talk about institutions with power, then what intolerance of intolerance looks like becomes very different. Because if we're talking about the government being intolerant of racist speech, then that ultimately means at the end of the day, putting people in prison because they said something you disagree with. So now these people don't take it to the end conclusion of what they're proposing, but you have to wonder, are you saying that we should be intolerant of intolerance in our day-to-day lives? And in that case, I think that's a personal decision anyone can make. And if you want to be intolerant of intolerance, then fine. But if you're saying that as a society, we should do this, as, institutions with power, we should do this, then that is a very different and very insidious conversation that actually, if anything is going to be compared to authoritarianism or fascist regimes, then the government shutting down dissenting speech is actually a much closer comparison.
Yes, absolutely. Because the issue is, if you want there to be limits on speech and ideas, then someone has to decide which speech is acceptable. You can either say, it's up to us as people, as citizens, to sort of negotiate that, which would be your example with your friends and what you choose to do in your interpersonal life and what you choose to say and contradict others around you. We could leave it up to that and sort of trust our fellow citizens to converse about things. And sometimes we're going to have to hear ugly things. Or we can put the power in the hands of the government to decide what is and what is not acceptable speech. And there are examples throughout history when the power was granted to the government to control speech in some forms. Of course, the president is going to tap down on dissent or on things being said that are against the president. Of course, this is what power will use this to protect its power.
Yeah, and I think there's also just a total lack of self-awareness in a lot of this. Maybe I should go ahead and read the next slide, which says, over the past 4 years, conservatives have responded to any reaction against hatred with so much for the tolerant left. This has been said when counter-protests have fought back against white supremacy, when social media platforms have removed accounts that promote hatred, division, and inaccurate information, when boycotts have taken place, and so on. So I think what's really interesting here is they're framing intolerance very much as a conservative thing. I mean, the first intolerance, not their intolerance of it, the initial act of intolerance, they're putting 100% on the conservative side here. And something that I find really interesting is that in their initial slide defining tolerance and intolerance, it's not about disagreeing with someone, it's about not accepting the disagreement. And in a lot of experience that I've had, conservatives do accept that someone feels differently from them. Not always, there certainly are intolerant people on every side, but from what I've seen, the left these days is much more likely to perpetuate their definition that they've put forward here on So You Want to Talk About of intolerance, where it's the refusal to accept that someone could have a different idea from you. And what they've done here by framing the first act of intolerance as occurring on the conservative side, and therefore saying, well, we must be intolerant of this, is they're talking in circles for one, but also they're completely removing any responsibility they have to be tolerant of different ideas, because some of the comments I was actually reading while you were talking, and someone points out, how far should we take this? What about being against gun control or universal health care? These are, and they go on to elaborate that these are important human rights issues that literally are life and death for some people. So should we be intolerant of disagreement on those issues? And someone says, well, that's not the same as racism and homophobia. But it's a good question,
Right.
Where do you draw the line?
Right, exactly. The point is, where do you draw the line? Who decides where you draw the line? If you don't trust other citizens to know where to draw the line, then you can't decide for them. If you can't trust them to draw the line for you, then you can't draw the line for them. That's why we are a country of laws and not men.
Yeah, I was just about to say, speaking of laws, in the United States, we do have something called the First Amendment, which there actually are limits on free speech that the courts have upheld. So, for example, you're not allowed to engage in things called fighting words, or things that are considered incitements to violence, a call to harm someone specifically. So, things like that are already considered not protected speech, not because they're intolerant, but because they actually cause harm to happen to someone, physical harm. You're also, for example, you're able to be held liable in civil courts for things like libel or defamation. So, there are limits on free speech, but it's not around what's considered tolerant or intolerant. You can say something perfectly intolerant that is still free speech. And, I think this brings us to some of their examples of intolerance to really see what they're actually getting at here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the First Amendment, the way it's been upheld, it's a very narrow category of what is unacceptable speech. It's not broad. It's specific and narrow. And if to be incitement to violence, it has to be direct incitement to violence, like go harm that guy over there. So yeah, let's go ahead and look at the next slide.
So on their next slide, they list some examples of intolerance. They include things like racism, xenophobia, homophobia / transphobia, which we're going to get to, hate groups, and hate speech. So this is particularly interesting because some of the stuff on here maybe could be in certain cases not protected free speech. So if, for example, like we just talked about, you are actually inciting someone to violence, but most of what they have listed here, prejudice or antagonism towards someone based on a certain trait, or language targeting someone because of a trait, or directed at someone because of their identity. What's really interesting to me reading this is that they're not even keeping with their own definition of intolerance. There's nothing here that says racism is the rejection that someone can be a different race, or that someone can be a different race and be, have a different idea than me. So if we go back to the original definition of intolerance, the not being able or willing to accept that someone's ideas or life are different from yours, none of that is actually included in prejudice or discrimination or antagonism directed against people because of their specific traits or identities. That those are not actually the same thing that they just said intolerance were.
The next slide says we should tolerate protesting, freedom of speech, and dissent. We should not tolerate protesting with the intent of causing harm to others, example, Charlottesville. Freedom of speech with the intent of causing harm to others, example, hate speech. And we should not tolerate dissent with the intent of causing harm to others, example, dissent of rights. So again, what does that mean? Who gets to define that? What do we get to dissent about? There's no freedom of speech unless you have freedom of speech for everybody's opinion.
Right. And it's totally one-sided because at the end of the day, so for example, I see a lot of gender theory and gender ideology as being a threat to women's rights, but I would not be granted the, whatever assumptions they're making here, that their dissent of my rights is intolerant and therefore I should be intolerant of it. It's completely one-sided. It's what they see as rights. And, a lot of times the big questions that we have in society are the clash of rights. It's the clash of the right for the gun owner to own their gun versus the clash of the right for someone to be in a space where there isn't a deadly weapon around them. And it's this is a clash of rights. And ultimately, one person's right will win and the others will lose. There may be some compromises on some issues, but a lot of times when you're dealing with a clash of rights, the idea of the dissent of rights is all about just which side you're on, which right you view as being the more important one. Right. And there isn't necessarily a right or wrong answer on those. It's about your values. Do you value personal liberty or societal safety? And at the end of the day, you can't say my value is the one that is correct and your value is the one that's wrong. Therefore, your dissent is the one that is intolerant and I should therefore be intolerant of you. It's completely one-sided. And then the idea of protesting with intent of causing harm, freedom of speech with the intent of causing harm. Well, at the end of the day, when you say that misgendering someone is literal violence, and we're going to get into some of this later, but if you say that speech that is a disagreement does cause harm, and you say, well, you've been made aware of this, therefore you have intent to cause harm, then essentially any speech that someone finds offensive, if you can say that that somehow relates to harm, even if the harm is, I feel like my feelings are hurt, that's harm. And therefore anything that someone could disagree with or find offensive should be not tolerated. I mean, does this mean that someone shouldn't be able to, peg it on the street corner and say, don't have brown hair? Some of us have brown hair. I would find that offensive. But this is literally hate speech. This is something that should be, but this person should be put in prison for doing that because they want everyone to dye their hair blonde. It's an absolute insane standard that if they weren't on the side that was currently popular, they would be fighting for the right to say what they're saying right now. And it's only because they feel that they're in the comfortable position that they're able to say people should have less freedom of speech. Because at the end of the day, the people who are trying to change the status quo, the revolutionaries, the people who are fighting back against the people in control, the people in power, those are the ones whose speech is threatened constantly across history, across time, across countries and all across the world. The people who are in power are silencing the speech of the people who are trying to overthrow them. And if you are on the side of limiting freedom of speech, you are on the side of the status quo at the end of the day. There's just no debating this. And actually, you know what? I think there is debating it. Feel free to debate it. I regret saying that. You can debate this all you want, and I'm going to tolerate it.
Beautiful.
So there.
And, the civil rights movement used free speech to promote their goals, and they needed freedom of speech, and it helped them advance their goals, and it helped us get to the point that we are today with civil rights. Another example about
Martin Luther King Jr. was literally talking about freedom of speech and the importance of our civil liberties in a speech he gave right before he was assassinated, for using that freedom of speech to get civil liberties for people who were denied it. I mean, this is something, as an animal rights activist, actually, this is when I first realized the importance of freedom of speech, because I learned that corporations were able to make laws where people who spoke out against something that was happening in a factory farm, for example, were put in prison. And I mean, this wasn't just a theoretical law. People are to this day sitting in a prison cell because they spoke out against a factory farm. And to say, I mean, you could say that's trying to cause harm to people. Like maybe you're trying to, reduce the income that a particular farming family gets. The people that own this farm, like their income might suffer, and therefore they might suffer material consequences, and that is harm. So, I mean, is that hate speech? Is animal rights hate speech?
Right.
It's all about who's in power.
I was going to say another example is, do you want corporations to have more rights to exploit people and to exploit the planet and animals? Because if we're not allowed to dissent rights, are we allowed to dissent the rights of corporations? Am I allowed to dissent the right of a surgeon to cut off the healthy breaths of a teenage girl? Like you said, if we can't dissent rights, we can't even discuss how to advance rights for all people.
Yeah. Something else I find really insidious here is under the protesting section, they say we should not tolerate protest with the intent to cause harm to others. Example, Charlottesville. And, to remind everyone, in Charlottesville, what happened was, I believe someone ran a vehicle through a crowd of protesters, and a woman was hit by the vehicle and killed. And see, the thing is we already don't tolerate that in society because it is vehicular manslaughter. There are criminal charges for actually assaulting and killing someone. And the idea that this is related to someone's speech or ideas is it's a complete derailment from the issue. Like, you're not allowed to run a car through a crowd of people. You're already not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to assault people, and you're not allowed to murder people. Those things are already not allowed. So we don't need to have additional societal intolerance for those things, nor should it be used as an example for protesting that has the intent to cause harm to others, because this is not something that falls into this intolerance category anyways. It's just a total non-issue in this specific debate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and once again, this is the type of rhetoric that has been used against left-wing protesters. I just watched the movie, the Chicago 7, I think it was, and it's about Abby Hoffman and a protest that took place at the Democratic National Convention in, I'm forgetting the exact year, but amidst the Vietnam War, I believe, and the leaders of the protest were arrested and charged because the police actually turned violent, and it was a orgy of police violence and police brutality. But because they accused the protesters of going out with the intent to start fights and to cause harm, that was the state, the power, once again, using these exact ideas against people who were fighting the status quo and who were protesting for peace. And then also, that what you had just said reminded me, I did have another point on 2 slides prior to the one we're looking at. The slide that says so much for the tolerant left. This slide is also full of, this is a straw man argument, because they're saying that first they're saying anyone who says so much for the tolerant left is a conservative responding to any reaction against hatred. Well, no, because if I were to say that, that would not be an accurate description of me or why I'm saying it. And then they said, this has been said when counter protesters have fought back against white supremacy, when social media platforms have removed accounts that propagate hatred, division, and inaccurate information, when boycotts have taken place, and so on. When I say so much for the tolerant left, I'm thinking of young women getting fired from their jobs early in their careers for talking about women's sex-based rights. So that's a straw man argument, and that's pretty unfair.
Yeah, and in that case, in the case of us being fired for dissenting with gender ideology, we recognized that people had a different point of view of us. And that's actually why we were writing or tweeting about the different point of view that we have. And they were the ones who were not willing to accept that someone could have a different point of view or life experience. It's absolutely insane that they set out these definitions and then don't see when it applies to them. I mean, neither of us could they will say that we're hateful, but if you're truly to dig through anything you or I have put out in writing or on this channel, I think that you would be really hard pressed to find anything that could be remotely taken as hateful. In fact, I at least know that I'm coming from a point of compassion and empathy for the people who are harmed by all of this ideology, including trans-identified people themselves, for the record. And to say that we're the intolerant ones in that situation, while also having this definition of intolerance, that is the being unwilling to accept that someone's ideas or lives are different from your own. You have to wonder, what is the real paradox here? But then, this thread on Instagram, or whatever you call it, it ends with saying, they say so much for the tolerant left. Good. Standing up and refusing to tolerate behavior and language that causes pain for others is the only way forward. Don't tolerate hate. We'll all be better for it. And ending on this note is just so ridiculous. For one, they say don't tolerate hate, but what they actually said in the beginning was that intolerance is not being willing to accept that other people have different ideas. So they kind of start off with what intolerance actually is, and then they slowly, throughout the course of this 6 or 7 slide thread, have shifted the definition of intolerance to be hate. And it's so insidious how they've done this, because if you're not really looking at how they're using a specific word on any given slide to see how it changes, then you wouldn't realize what happened as you were just swiping through this very quickly on Instagram. And the idea that it's good that the left has become intolerant to intolerance is, it's a paradox, because at the end of the day, well, okay, if they're intolerant of what they see as my intolerance, then if I want to create the world that I think is right, then shouldn't I be intolerant of their intolerance by their own logic? And then we just end up with a complete circle of intolerance, of everyone being told that we're supposed to not tolerate the other person's ideas. And what society do they think this is going to create? Mm-hmm. What ultimately is the end goal here?
Right. Exactly. And that's exactly why I wanted to start with this post, because this is not a video to disparage this whole entire Instagram page and everything that is said on this page, but we're trying to show that the way that they're presenting the information is not neutral in an educational way. It's putting forward a worldview that consists of a very narrow set of beliefs and saying that this is the worldview that should be imposed on everyone and that should be the way forward. They're not just saying, here's some information and here's what we think. They're saying, this is the way. And I find that disturbing no matter what is being said, even if I agree with what's being said.
I am sympathetic to using specific rhetorical devices to make your point, to even using propaganda to make your point. And what really disturbs me is that this is not recognized as such, is that this is recognized as educational. And one of the next slides that we'll look at talks about, if you have a question, you need to educate yourself. And this is something that is constantly said in liberal SJW communities, is you need to educate yourself. And this doesn't mean almost ever that you are actually uneducated on an issue. It usually means that you disagree with what the party line is on the issue. And in fact, I would say that I am personally probably 100 times more educated on gender identity and like all of its many facets than probably 90 99 even percent of people who go around talking about this and telling other people to educate themselves on it. The idea here is not that you actually need to get an education on the issue, because if you got an education on the issue, you might actually be a threat to them. The idea is that they're going to say, you need to educate yourself. And by the way, here's 7 little slides where we've summed up everything you need to know, and you don't need to go read the book. You don't need to think about this anymore because I have just educated you. Boom, fixed.
Exactly. And when I first saw this, I followed the link from like a Sophie Turner post. She's like a Game of Thrones actress. So I knew that it was something that shallow people were using to engage with politics. Now, I'm not saying she in particular.
Wow, Sophie Turner hate channel. Who knew?
Yeah, this is what this is. But what I'm saying is celebrities are shallow and they engage with politics on a pandering bullshit level. If a celebrity, if all the celebrities are talking about a particular issue, it's because they see it as a fashion trend. So it's useful for me to sometimes be aware of what these trends are. But what you just said is perfectly reflected in the caption of the next post we're going to do, which says, following Elliot Page's brave and inspiring announcement a few weeks ago, I received an influx of requests for a breakdown of how to best be an ally to the trans community. So I teamed up with the amazing Trevor Project for some tips on allyship. This is doing exactly what you just said. It's telling you what to think. Here's the right line. Here's the party line. Here, like, you don't need to think about it. You don't need to go read about it anymore. You don't need to use your brain. Just swallow the pill we're handing you.
Yeah. And for anyone who didn't catch that, that was Elliot Page, aka Ellen Page, who recently came out as a trans man, or was it non-binary? But exactly right. So the first post in this thread, or I guess the second after the title slide, says the first step to becoming an ally to the transgender and non-binary community is to, in big, bold, pink text, learn more. The fact that this thread, by the way, is the learn more is in pink. And I have to say that just already to me is like, hey, women, we're going to make this attractive to you based on, by the way, the gender stereotypes that we claim to be against, and say, you need to learn more about this. So then the slide goes on. It can be tough for transgender and non-binary people to bear the burden of educating others about their lived experience. Choosing to educate ourselves is the first step in becoming allies. With this education, you'll be able to better support the trans and non-binary folks in your lives and help create a safer, kinder, and more accepting world. So in this slide, they're essentially saying, we're going to give you 10 slides about gender identity. And with these 10 slides and nothing more, you will be fully equipped to go out into the world and be a better person. And
it's don't think critically about Elliot Page's announcement. Don't use your own powers of perception and think, wait, was this ever a woman? Is this a woman? Don't think about that. Just come to us and we'll tell you what to think. And we'll tell you how to interpret that confusing announcement of Elliot Page.
Yeah, exactly. And the slides themselves, there's so many, I'm not sure we could read the entire thing. They start out by defining terms such as sex and gender. And by the way, their definitions are nonsense.
So it says sex and gender, what's the difference? And then they give these definitions. So sex is the classification of a person as male, female, or intersex. Intersex is not a third sex or a fourth or a fifth sex. When we are born, doctors usually decide whether male or female will be listed on our birth certificate, as if they arbitrarily decide this, when that's not the case at all. I want to skip the rest of the definition. We've spent a lot of airtime in general, and a lot has been written on why that definition of sex is faulty. But what I'm really bothered by here is their definition of gender. It says, gender describes our internal understanding and experience of our own gender identity. That's circular. They're using the word to define the word. So we are left with the word gender undefined. It has not been defined now. Gender describes our internal understanding of our own gender. That's not an explanation. And then they say each person's experience of their own gender identity is unique and personal and can't be known simply by looking at a person. So this is something that you decide. No one can decide for you. No one can tell. No one can know from looking at you. But it's not something that we even know what it is. We can't define it. And I think that if they had said, gender describes our internal understanding and experience of our own sex. That would have been an interesting definition. I think we could have worked with that definition, because I would actually agree that probably most people do have some kind of experience and thought process related to their own sex. Most people do. That's pretty human. And that might be one interesting definition of gender, but that's not what they've said here. So they've left that undefined. They've said it's an understanding of our own gender identity. What does that mean?
And then the next 10 slides or so, they never go on to define gender identity. They go on to list some common genders, which include cisgender, transgender, non-binary, and two-spirit, which, by the way, is so common as to be listed among the top 4 genders. And by the way, also interesting that when you actually normally hear people talk about what their gender identity is, they usually say man or woman, male or female, boy or girl. And instead what they're saying here is cisgender, transgender is your gender. So like, I feel like they're actually even wrong, even by the gender ideology line. Like, if I were a trans activist, I feel like I could tear this apart for so many reasons. Like, they're just wrong on all of it, just to begin with.
Yes.
Then they go on to define
that in the comments.
Yeah, good. Call them out. So then they go on to define gender expression, not gender identity, which is still hanging undefined. And they say gender expression can be a fun, creative, and affirming way to express yourself. So by this definition, like, the clothes you wear, like your hairstyle, your, like, the song you sing in the shower when you're expressing yourself, the art you doodle on your notebook, like, all of this is part of your gender expression, which somehow relates in an undefined way to your gender identity. And then they say you can't tell someone's gender by looking at them. But if gender is related to your gender expression, I mean, expression is a very outwardly thing that you're doing, you're expressing it. So you should be able to tell someone's gender expression. I mean, they just are throwing around all of this stuff. It's all completely nonsensical if you actually read it. And I think what's interesting about this particular thread compared to some of the other threads on this channel or on this Instagram account is that the text on these 10 slides is so heavy. There's so much text. There are, on one of these slides, I'm looking at 3 full paragraphs on an Instagram post. And keep in mind, like, most Instagram posts that have text have like a little phrase that can be like easily quoted. Like, you could say it out loud in a couple seconds. And there's so much text on this. I mean, just estimating, I'm seeing probably like 500 words total across this thread, possibly even more. And it does not seem like it's actually meant to be read and understood, because this account seems very good at making graphics and like really short snippets of text that are meant to be quickly read and understood. This is one of their biggest threads that I see, and it is the most text heavy. And I just cannot genuinely believe that their goal is to have someone actually read and understand this.
Here's my interpretation from when I was scrolling through this. I don't think these are meant to be read and understood. I think they're meant to be read and regurgitated. They'll have a bunch of posts that are like 100 reasons why blank is wrong, or Trump and women, which, by the way, they didn't have one on Biden and women. So that I find offensive as a woman, but okay. And I think that these are like things where you can either use them to virtue signal by just reposting it on your own Instagram account, because a lot of people do that, 0 effort, or you can copy paste or just borrow their little phrases if you're arguing or debating with someone. You don't even have to like put it through your brain and understand it. You just take it and use it. That's why they're like putting these little chunks of information.
Yeah. That is such a good point. And, you know, actually, as I'm scrolling through these comments, the number one thing that I see in these comments is not actually a comment. It's just a simple tag of another user. And they are tagging in people to say, here, you need to read this. They're not even saying anything about it. They're just saying, here, read this. And That is so interesting. This is actually just meant to be a thing that you send your problematic friend to as I can't be bothered to explain this, probably because I don't understand it and I can't explain it. So here, read this and, like it says in the big pink text, educate yourself.
Precisely.
And as one of the next slides says, it says what to do if you've offended someone. And first of all, I think this is really interesting because it puts the onus of someone else's emotional response on you. So, I mean, this is like therapy 101, is that you cannot control or are responsible for someone else's emotional response. You can only control your own behavior and your own self. But here we're saying that because someone is offended, then you have to, number one, listen. Number two, be accountable. And number three, commit to doing better. And they have long paragraphs that elaborate on like a lot of this, saying things like intention is not impact, and all of the stuff that we hear about what to do when you have caused offense. This is particularly interesting because if you take this out of, they don't actually say anything about gender identity on the slide that I'm seeing. They might, oh yeah, okay, maybe a little bit. Maybe they talk about misgendering on here, but for the most part, it just seems to be what to do if you've offended someone. Now, if I say something to you like, Sasha, I really don't like that blue paint on your wall, then and you're offended by that, then your offense to that is on me to commit to doing better and being a better person, rather than on me to, I can, if I choose to, change my behavior based on your response, but it's not on me. Like, you had an emotional response to that theoretically. Or here's the thing, like, you can actually control your own emotional response. You could actually not be offended by that. You could say, oh, well, I like it, so I have it. It's my room. Like, yeah. By the way, I have no issue with your paint, but.
Thank you, because that was important. We needed to establish that. But yeah, they're setting people up to not be good at regulating their own emotions. That's a great point there on the psychological side. And then I want to go, one thing to throw in there, you mentioned the intent. They're saying your intent isn't as important as the outcome. Well, which is it? Because in the other one about the paradox of intolerance, you're like, if you have the intent to harm, you should be an outlaw, basically. So which is it? Does intent matter or not?
That is a super good point.
Yeah, and then another thing is that this is made with the Trevor Project, which when I was a teenager, I thought they were quite respectable, and they used to tell us it gets better. And they're like, we're here for gay kids and it will get better. Not so much the message anymore. Now the message is it gets worse. If you have dysphoria, which, by the way, dysphoria is not mentioned on this whole entire presentation. How can you not talk about dysphoria? Why is dysphoria now verboten? And that takes us back to, I need to go back to this slide about where they define sex and gender in the beginning, and they give this nebulous, vague definition of gender. So that's a belief, and that's fine. Like, I don't care if you believe in this vague, undefined concept, or if you want to apply it to yourself. That's not a problem. It reminds me a little bit of like the Holy Ghost. I'm not super well versed about what that even means, but it's kind of like the Holy Ghost is God, and God is the three entities, but God is one entity and they're different entities. It's kind of confusing and circular. I don't know if you have anything to say about that in terms of like this circular definition. It reminds me of a religious belief. But I would say that's completely fine for them to have this sort of pseudo-religious belief. But then you hit next, and on the next slide, you see we are all included in this, because common genders include cisgender. That's the first one listed. So people like us are now cisgender, which means that our gender identity aligns with the sex we were assigned at birth. We are now basically having a gender identity imposed on us when it hasn't even been defined. So that's someone else's religious belief that I don't agree with. And I think also that they've really gone wrong here in saying that gender is an understanding and experience of our own gender, rather than saying it's an understanding of our sex. Because I think that as a definition, as a way of understanding transgender, would be pretty easy to get. Like, trans people have this internal sense of unease or dis-ease in their sexed body because they don't feel right in male or female. And so sometimes they'll feel more comfortable transitioning to live socially in the other sex role. I think people can kind of like pretty easily understand that and get on board with that. I certainly support that and am on board with that. The problem is that that's not what they're saying. They're not even making a nod to dysphoria. In another slide, they say transitioning. Transitioning looks different for different people, and there is no right way to express your gender. Some people medically transition and others do not. This may be related to personal expression, lack of access to gender-affirming healthcare, medical conditions that prevent certain procedures, or other reasons. Transitioning is more complicated than just a surgery, can take place over a number of years, da-da-da-da-da. Some people decide not to transition at all. Under no circumstances should you ask unprompted questions about a trans or non-binary person's body, genitals, medical history, etc. Now, if gender identity is this vague, nebulous, pseudo-religious concept that is being put on all of us, but that's also held up alongside this idea that you don't have to transition to be transgender, what that's saying is that you can have a purely internal identity and everybody has to affirm it. That's what they're saying here. So what would the difference be for them between a man who identifies as a woman and does nothing to transition and any other man? How are we supposed to tell the difference? But one of them we're supposed to uncritically accept as women.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. Because as soon as you start to draw the line, then you are true trans or true scum, and you're on the outs with that group. And it's so interesting because this thread says a couple of times in a couple different ways that we can't know anything about someone's internal state. We have to ask them. It's always best to confirm with the person what their name and pronouns are. And that idea being that pronouns are code for what your gender identity is, because it could be different from your gender expression and your gender perception. And I mean, obviously now, this is just getting into the whole gender debate, but it's just really clear that there is nothing cohesive happening here. And the entire purpose of this is just to give people some sort of like, hey, look, I'm doing the right thing. Like I have, I've tagged my friend on this to help educate them. I have liked this post and therefore I'm a good ally. And I mean, as I'm scrolling through the comments here, I'm actually seeing multiple people who are calling out the things that are wrong with this, even from a gender ideology perspective. It is so bad. And yet the framing from the very beginning is you need to educate yourself. And I just have to wonder, what education did the author of this post do? Like, what time did they actually spend educating themselves on this issue? Because it really seems like zero. And yet the Trevor Project has signed off on this. But by the way, they end this thread with a post about if you're feeling suicidal, you can contact the Trevor Project. And correct me if I'm wrong here, Sasha, but on looking through, I don't think I saw anything about suicide in the entire post. And it's really interesting to me that this is a thread about gender identity and it's all framed as super positive and it's all, you can make a kinder, safer, more accepting world by doing these things. But then the very last note is, if this post makes you want to kill yourself, then here's a number you can call. And I'm never against suicide prevention, being an important step. I think that we should plaster these numbers, maybe not the specific one. I don't know them that well, but the crisis text line and the suicide national hotline, I think that, those should be numbers that are plastered all across, your fridge, your desk. Like, I'm all for that. So this is not against suicide prevention, but the implication in putting it here, this wasn't on the last slide. There was no suicide prevention text line on the Paradox of Progress thread. It's on this one because there's this implicit idea that people are at risk because of everything that's happening here, and like because of gender identity. And they have some other threads, this one on Transgender Awareness Week, that really exemplify some of the myths around the risk that certain people face. And it's by ending on this slide, it feels like what they're doing is punctuating all of their nonsense with something that says, this is vitally important. Everything we just said, like if it sounded like nonsense, if it didn't make sense to you, if you skimmed it, if you don't understand it, it doesn't matter, because this is a life and death issue. And we constantly see this framing as anything around gender identity is a life and death issue. And I just cannot feel okay with them putting this slide here out of nowhere, because to me, I mean, most best practices on reporting about suicide aren't like, oh, you should just tell people that they should be feeling suicidal all the time. It's the opposite. And so the fact that there was nothing about suicide, or honestly, even mental health or like mental wellness, even from a positive perspective throughout any of this, and then they just throw that little reminder, hey, are you feeling suicidal? Like that actually seems really irresponsible to me, and that the entire purpose is, number one, to plug this organization, and the service that they offer, but number two, to punctuate all of their nonsense with this air of importance.
Yeah. Yes, and they do say on one of the slides, respecting the language that people use to identify their gender is not only the polite and appropriate thing to do, it can also save lives. In a recent study of transgender youth, using chosen names at home, at school, at work, and with friends reduced depressive symptoms, suicidal ideation, and suicidal behavior. They are holding the bludgeon of suicide over your head if you do not agree with this, and as you said. And also, I spoke to Helen Joyce for my first interview on my podcast, on my channel, and we talked about this article that was in the New York Times a few years ago, and it was called "It's Binding or Suicide." And the whole article was testimonies from teenage girls who bind. And, the side effects of this binding are horrible. It's like reduced lung capacity, like bone damage, trouble breathing. And it's really serious stuff. It also damages your breasts. And this article was saying that if kids don't do this, they will kill themselves. So I asked Helen Joyce about this, and she said, that's completely unethical journalistic practice, as you just said, MK. They should not be doing that. There are guidelines about reporting on suicide, and that is way out of bounds. And I think this probably would be too.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, we actually covered this in the Wolf Media Style Guide on reporting on sex and gender and LGBT issues. And one of the things that really jumped out at me while doing the research on the ethical guidelines on reporting on suicide is there's a really important point made that you should not be saying that this group of people is doomed to suicide, or that this particular action will result in suicide, or any of these particular things that make it seem inevitable, because this inevitability around suicide is what honestly, I mean, makes it so dangerous. This is what creates these rash of suicides that we see when they start to hit the media among a particular age or identity group. And I mean, as someone who lost a loved one to suicide, I can say that it is completely irresponsible to be essentially promoting suicide as this is what happens naturally. This is the natural end of this life cycle if you don't do XYZ thing that I say. I mean, it's completely irresponsible. And any journalist who is following ethical reporting would not be doing this, And it's not just journalists, though. It's doctors, it's psychiatrists. I know of families where parents were told, like, you're either going to have a dead son or an alive daughter. Which do you want? Assuming the child is male. And, we hear stories of this time and time again from parents of transition children where they are essentially told, your child will die unless you do this. Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, where did they get that idea from?
Right. And what's possibly even more disgusting than this particular post using that as a bludgeon over your head if you don't agree, is that they're giving their readers this bludgeon to use over the head of people who don't agree with them. So you're going to read this, you're not even going to understand what the fuck they're talking about. And then when you get into a conversation with someone about it and they're asking too many questions or they're criticizing it, you can just go, oh, well, that saves lives to use the correct pronouns. And otherwise, these people are going to be killing themselves. Like, they've given them this tool that they can use in an argument that's not even the actual argument, but you can't really argue back against it because it's such an intense thing to say.
And this brings us back to the intent to cause harm, because then you can say that misgendering is an intent to cause harm, because these people will kill themselves if they're, called used the wrong pronoun for them behind their back or something. It really just is completely insidious. And the fact that this account is so popular and that there's so little critical response to it, and I mean, besides actually from the trans activist perspective, which I find really interesting. Now, there are people in the comments who are dissenting, but not much. For the most part, it's people tagging in their friends. It's saying, this is so informative. There's people saying, I never heard about Two-Spirit. Thank you. And I mean, that's a whole other thing, by the way, just the idea of using another culture to perpetuate your own bullshit is just, there's a lot of racism going on in a lot of these arguments, but yeah. I don't know. I guess we're supposed to tolerate that racism.
Right. Absolutely. So, MK, we kind of went through and really dissected these things. We did not go easy on them, which we shouldn't, because if you're putting this out there, you should be subject to scrutiny, and that's actually a healthy thing to do. So what do you think in terms of like, what should our response be to this, just as individual consumers of information and citizens going around with this information out there and millions of people sort of soaking it up? What do we do with this information?
So, I mean, I guess the first thing that I think is I recognize that these people have a different opinion, idea, and life experience from me. And I tolerate that. I think that they should be allowed to have this Instagram, and they should be allowed to, say these things that are misinformation, if not outright lies, but, a framing that I consider actually harmful. And, I think that I'm going to tolerate it in the sense that I'm not going to try to get them banned from Instagram. But I do think that kind of on a larger scale, it's important for us to find a way to become a little bit more literate about what we're consuming on social media. And it's easy to dissect something that we disagree with, but what happens when the posts are things that we agree with? And, there's actually, because this is kind of a general progressive account, there's actually a lot of stuff on here that, like you said in the beginning, that I do agree with too. And so how do we demand more from these sorts of really prominent voices? For example, I saw in the comments of one of these, someone asking for a particular source on something that they claimed. And it wasn't even done in that negative way. They were saying, wow, this is really interesting. I would love to read more. Do you have a source on that? Something I think is really interesting. And I know Instagram, the format does not lend itself to this, but there are not sources listed for anything here. I think this is one of the most basic things that we can do, is if we are creating content, there should be the expectation that sources are linked. And, of course, the links to everything we've talked about will be in the description today. But when you're consuming content, I think that if there is a source, and here's something else that I think I see happen a lot, is if you just see that little footnote, if you just see the little underlying link, you see, oh, that's sourced. You don't actually check it out and read it. It's easy to say there should be sources. What about when the sources are twisted? What about when the study doesn't actually say what they claim it says? I think that we really need to become a little bit more analytic about everything that we consume. And I also think that, it's easy for us to say this, like, oh yeah, we should do this, and to act like, oh yeah, everything that we do is always super informed on every issue. And I cite all my sources and I read all the studies, paper to beginning to end. Of course we don't, everyone only has a limit on what they can actually be an expert to any degree in. And I think that what we need to do is maybe just be a little bit more comfortable with acknowledging that we don't know things, and to stop saying that reading an Instagram post is educating yourself, but to instead say, I'm actually not that educated on this issue. Here's my feeling on it. Like if you're a trans activist or coming from that perspective, maybe you could say, I'm actually not that educated on it, but I feel like we should be accepting of everyone no matter what. And I don't see anything wrong with people being who they are. If that's your opinion, like based on the very little that you know about the topic, okay, just say that you don't know that much about it, and vice versa.
Yeah.
If you are on the, other side of it, the radical feminist side, then you can just say, I don't actually know a lot about that specific thing that you're saying, but my instinct is that a man can never become a woman and those differences matter.
Right.
And then when someone is acting like they know what they're talking about and you can tell they don't, I think it's important to get comfortable with saying, what's the source there? And, why do you think that?
Mm-hmm.
But doing it in a compassionate way that recognizes, well, just because you're saying this thing that I think is really insidious, that maybe you're not doing it out of a intent to harm. I don't think the person running this account genuinely wants to harm anyone or do anything bad or spread misinformation. I think that they probably think that they're doing something good for the world. And maybe in 90% of their posts they are. We can recognize that and then also say, we need to talk about this. Like, so you want to talk about it? Yeah, I do. I want to talk about this. Let's actually get real for a sec.
Yes. And, this to me, it feels like the Forever 21 of opinions. It's like, I'm going to go in there, I'm going to get what's trendy, and I don't really need to think about it or decide what I really like or what I really think, because it's all laid out for me. I'm going to go in there and get the shoes that are trendy, AKA I'm going to learn what I'm supposed to think about this topic. I'm going to get the shirt that's trendy, learn what I'm supposed to think about this topic. And that's what this whole account really strikes me as. It's not like presenting something for people who are really thirsty for knowledge and have curiosity and philosophical, pursuits. It's for people who just want that fast food. That's another, I guess, analogy. It's like fast food. Like, let me just find out what I'm supposed to think so that I can virtue signal and then get out.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's just really indicative of the larger cultural problems where the politics that you have are considered like a badge of honor that says something about your morality as a person and how good or how righteous you are. And if you like or share this post on Instagram, then that makes you a good, righteous person. And I think we really just need to get out of this very shallow, as you put it, mindset around politics. And I think that needs to happen on all sides of this. I think that, this isn't just a problem that we see in SJW communities. I certainly have seen my fair share of conservative memes and propaganda that spread misinformation. And, even on the gender critical side, we do have people who, are just saying things without really knowing much about it. And sometimes I do it myself, but
we all do, and that's okay. And I think that the point is that if you're doing it while in the pursuit of knowledge and understanding, that's good. That's fine. That's why we have freedom of speech. You're free to make a mistake, to say the wrong thing. That's totally okay. But if you're just regurgitating things because you think that's what you're supposed to believe, like you said, because it's part of this persona that you feel you have to have, that's what's a little bit more contemptible.
And let's stop pretending that bite-sized politics is an education in anything.
Thank you guys for tuning in today. We have new episodes every Monday.
If you have something you would like us to talk about, then you can submit a question anonymously to submit@identitycrisis.xyz. You can be sure to follow 4W and Plebity on Twitter and across the internet. You can also get this podcast anywhere where you listen to your podcasts.